Welcome to our webinar today about the Species Environmental Assessment Guideline. My name is Tanya Frazier and I will be your monitor. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. And Attila, if you could progress to the next slide for me, please. Attila, could you hit next slide for me? As we're going to talk about today's webinar series is a part of webinars offered by IAIA. And I invite you to visit our website and check out the recordings of a few of our recent ones, such as air quality, microplastics, gender, emerging technologies, and many more. As you're watching the webinar today and in future times, please feel free to use our social media handles at IAIA Network and hashtag IAIA Webinar. And next slide, please. Thank you. Just a few housekeeping announcements. On the right, there is a control panel that has a red or orange arrow at the top that will swing the control panel in and out, so you have access to be able to close that so you can see the entire screen of presentation information. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available within the next 1 to 2 days following the presentation. This is a 90-minute webinar and there will be 2 sections for questions. If at any time you have questions during the presentation, there is a questions section at the right hand of your screen that you can enter those questions into. They will not be answered immediately, but they will be put into a queue and we will answer as many as we can during the question sections. There are slides available in the control panel under handouts and will also be emailed out to you following the presentation with the announcement of the presentation being ready to view. And with that, we'll go to the next slide. And it is my honor to introduce to you our presenter for today. Our presenter today is Domitila Raimondo. Domitila is the Threatened Species Unit Manager at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. She is responsible for the species assessments for South Africa's National Biodiversity Assessment. Domitila has extensive experience assessing the threat status for South Africa's animal and plant species, is the lead author of the Red List of South African Plants in 2009, and has coordinated the Red List assessments for many animal groups. She is dedicated to ensuring that species conservation work, species information feeds into the land use decision making. Domitila is also involved in species conservation work internationally, is the Deputy Chair of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and their Species Survival Commission, and serves on the IUCN's Red List Committee. And now I'll turn the presentation over to you, Domitila. Have fun.
Thank you, Tanya. So today I'm going to be speaking and presenting a new guideline that we've developed in South Africa to include species in the environmental assessment process. This work has been commissioned by the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and we're an entity of the Department of Environment Affairs. The work has actually been conducted by a specialist firm called EnviroInsights, and BirdLife South Africa has been partnering with SANBI in producing these guidelines. Okay, the work that we're presenting today has been funded by the United Nations Global Environment Fund. And it's available, this guideline that we're speaking about today is available at this link that you should be able to see now, bgsi.sambi.org. With me, who you'll see later, are two co-panelists. The first is Luc Verburgt. He's the head of EnviroInsight's firm and has been the lead technical author on this guideline. And then Abubele Adams from the CSIR has worked extensively to support the development, extensively with the Department of Environment Affairs and Fisheries and Forestry in the development of regulations to support EIAs, particularly the protocols. Okay, the structure of today's talk. So I'll first speak to you and give you an understanding of the purpose, why we need this guideline, and explain how it operates with the Environmental Impact Assessment Screening Tool. There has been a previous webinar on the screening tool, so we hope many of the participants here are aware of that. And then we will explain how the guideline talks to the recent regulation that has been produced for the two protocols, the animal CC and the plant CD species protocols that have been gazetted for comment. Well, they haven't been gazetted for implication. They've been published for comment early January. Comment period has closed, and we're now addressing the comments for that. But the guidelines speak specifically to the species protocol. Okay, and then I will talk through a little bit, give you some examples of what's actually in the guideline, show you specific areas such as the project area of influence, show you how there's specific guidance for particular taxa, and then we're going to pause after that and have a first session of questions. And then really an important component of our guideline is a new methodology to evaluate site ecological importance. And this is quite a technical process that I'll explain following our first question session. And it's going to have a lot of implication for the way specialist studies are done going forward. And then we finish off with a second question session. Okay, so let's start with the purpose. And I'm going to start off just by giving you a specific example about why we need these guidelines, and also why we've gone to a lot of effort in South Africa to make sure that species information is available for the decision-making process. So this is an example from one of our cities on the east coast of South Africa, Port Elizabeth, a valley called the Barkens River Valley. We have, across South Africa, we have extensive citizen science projects working to monitor species, and we have provincial conservation officials and various biologists who monitor species and provide that data to the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So in this particular case, we were aware that this particular site had 12 species of conservation concern. But there was a development application in the area outlined in the peach, and a specialist went out to site to evaluate it and reported absolutely no species of conservation concern for plants. Those 12 species of conservation concern were all plants. What has resulted is a huge mall with absolutely no mitigation or offsetting of, and we've lost 12 populations of very, very threatened species. So this is the kind of thing we absolutely do not want going forward. We want to minimize, in the absolute minimum case, make sure that all information that we know about where species of conservation concern is taken into account during the decision-making process. Okay, so our Ministry of Environment Affairs has also been working to help us strengthen the regulations to support decision-making, and has recently developed an online screening tool which serves data for species, and it serves data that needs to be taken into account for all environmental impact assessment processes. So that includes information on agriculture, on biodiversity, on all elements that need to be taken into account. and one of the layers that get served is species information. And if a species of conservation concern is triggered, what happens is during the development process, the specific protocols need to be followed, and these are the protocols shown here. So what we've done is develop guidelines to help EAPS and specialists to step-by-step interpret the protocol requirements. And these protocols, as I mentioned earlier, have been out for comment earlier this year. So they ran for comment from the 10th of Jan to the 24th of March. So hopefully many of you on this call have seen those protocols. Okay, and then these regulations fall under the listed activities in terms of NEMA, our National Environmental Management Act. Okay, so I am aware that you've heard about the screening tool, but for those who were not on the previous webinar and are not yet familiar with it, this is a tool that is online, and it's now regulated that for any development, the applicant needs to upload the development footprint, you see here, onto this website. And once the development footprint is uploaded, it intersects with all layers of sensitivity for that site. And it generates a screening report, which tells the applicant exactly what sensitivity layers have been intersected and what the requirements are to go ahead with either the basic assessment or the full EIA. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to explain what species data has gone into this tool and how we've actually developed the different layers of sensitivity that get triggered by the tool. Okay, so we have 4 layers of sensitivity for species, for our animal and plant layers that are currently served in the screening tool. The very, very high sensitivity is for species that are so restricted that their global population is in an area of less than 10 kilometers squared, which means that any development could literally make that species go extinct. It means that these are sites where there's no other option for them to be captured. They're completely irreplaceable. Our second level of sensitivity is the high category, and that is for all threatened species and other species of conservation concern. So that includes rare species that we have accurate records, recent records for. So what that means is where we have high category, we are absolutely sure there's a species of conservation concern there because it's been recently recorded and we've identified the exact patch of habitat where that species is found. And both the very high and high data is a very, very fine scale. Then the next level down is medium, which is where we suspect a species of conservation concern occurs. So we can't always be sure that we've searched everywhere. Especially in a megadiverse country like South Africa, there are many, many places that have not been surveyed. And so to take this into account, we've modeled suitable habitat for all of South Africa, for the groups of animals and plants included in the screening tool. And then the low category is where we have no evidence that there's a species of conservation concern known or predicted. Okay, so here you can see a little bit more detail of what goes into the protocol. So if you trigger any of these very high or medium sensitivity, what it means is that we require a taxon specialist to go out on site and to complete the requirements in the protocol. And there's clauses that specifically explain what the specialist needs to do and needs to record on site. Okay, so if it's one of those categories, you have to have a specialist. If it's not one of those categories, and if it's a low sensitivity, it means that it's possible for the EAP to produce a compliance statement. Okay, at this stage, the protocols say that the compliance statement needs to include the details of the person who's completed the compliance statement, etc. But it doesn't give a clear guidance of exactly what that compliance statement needs to look like. So we are hoping to work on that in the next couple of months and get a template so that that can be followed going forward. All right, so here's a concrete example for you. So if a developer, an applicant puts their development footprint here, they will get this screening tool report, which lists every species that it's intersecting with, and you get to see whether it's which kind of animal it is. So if it's a bird, or if it's an insect, or if it's a reptile, or if it's an amphibian. At this stage, we have information for birds, reptiles, amphibians, and selected insects. We need to improve insects. At the moment, we only have butterflies, but within the course of the next couple of months, we'll get all insects that are listed on the IUCN red list, on the red list onto the screening tool. And at this stage, it's terrestrial data, not yet aquatic data. So we don't have freshwater fish or dragonflies or other aquatic species. The aquatic protocols of those of you who have looked at it do talk about species of conservation concerns. So during that process, people need to look for those, but those are not yet triggered by screening tool layers. Right, so you get this report. At this particular site, these are the animals, and then there's normally lots of plants that come out because South Africa has really, really high plant diversity. You may notice that there's, in cases, the listing of sensitive species, the name is not given, just a number. This is quite important. We have many species in South Africa that are threatened by illegal poaching and hunting or collecting, and so we can't provide the names of all species. In the guideline, it's very clear what needs to be done. If there's a sensitive species, there's in the screening tool report, it notes the email address where you need to send the sensitive species number to get the detail of which species that is. The reason we do that is we need to know exactly who gets that information. So the specialist should apply for it, and then we keep the details of that specialist on record and the date that that information was provided. And this information is not to be included in the final report. So we will require that the final report only says critically endangered plant or rare plant or critically endangered reptile, but no more than that. Right, that guidance is very clear in the actual guideline. So here you can see this is the information that you get. And I wanted to just explain how we generate these layers. So on this map here, the very dark areas is at very, very high sensitivity for a species that has a global range of less than 10 kilometers squared. The red is the high, and then the orange is the medium. Then the green is the low sensitivity where we don't have information about threatened species occurring there. Okay, so the way we've generated this is we've taken all information we have for species, and SANBI does extensive work. We collaborate with all museums in South Africa, with all provincial agencies, with South African national parks, all the agencies that work on conservation of species, and we collate all this information together. And so we have thousands and thousands of records of where special species occur, and this is just the example for plants. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, people tend to collect and record observations of species along roads. You can see here a nice clear map of the Northern Cape along roads. And of course, there's many areas where people haven't actually sampled, but where you're likely to get threatened species. And so what we've done for every species is we've taken the known points shown here, and then we've actually modeled suitable habitat for them. And that's what has gone into the medium layer. And we have used the best models possible for species, and we have really, really qualified people doing the models. And we've minimized the amount of area that we select to go into these models to ensure that we're not triggering the requirements of specialists going out where that's not necessary. Okay. I'm now going to move on to what's actually included in the guideline. So there's a section on the purpose of the document explaining the legal context, and then explaining how the screening tool works. And then we go through explaining step by step how to implement the protocols. Now, the protocols consist of these very clear clauses that tell the specialists what they need to do. So, for example, here, the likelihood of other threatened species or undescribed species or highly localized endemics being found on the site, occurring in the vicinity. So there's clauses like this. And so what we've done following every clause is say what the minimum requirement is to fulfill the clause that's in the protocol. And we give specific examples of what must go in. And then we also refer the reader to sections of the guideline where we show tables and examples of how this needs to be done. So here's another example. There's a requirement in the protocol that buffers need to be included if species of conservation concern occur on the site. So when you're considering the impact on that species, you have to include the buffers. And so again, minimum requirements of how to identify the buffers. And then we've provided in each of the specific taxon sections what are appropriate buffers for the species. And you get tables like this in the guideline, which show exactly what we require, what is required, okay? So, and also a motivation for why it's necessary, and which species it applies to. So you can see here in this example. All right, and then we go on to defining very important elements that need to be included in specialist reports. The first is the project area of influence, and then we describe the description of impact receptors and go into the Site Ecological Importance, SEI. And then there's a general section that applies for any specialist, needs to have this included in their reports. That's information on how the field work must be conducted, impact analysis, etc., mitigation of impacts. So this applies to no matter which group of species is being worked on. And then there's specific taxon sections, so for each of the groups that are mentioned here. So flora, herpetofauna, avifauna, mammals, and butterflies. Okay, I'm not going to have time to take you through all of these because we only have a short seminar today. So I'm going to start off just showing you these taxon-specific guidelines and then take you through the project area of influence, and then we will break for questions. Okay, so the taxon sections are quite detailed. They explain how your fieldwork surveys need to be undertaken. They also explain desktop studies that need to happen beforehand, what's appropriate for that group. Please bear in mind that because we put so much effort into putting species information into the screening tool, we've done a lot of work to streamline that the desktop and the pre-survey and work required for specialists, and we hope that will speed the process up a lot. Then we talk about fieldwork timing, seasonality, and then the appropriate methods for each group. So just here one small example of how it's appropriate to trap reptiles, how long these kind of traps need to be out, and we give very, very clear guidance for what is expected. Right throughout the guideline, we are clear about what's a minimum requirement and then what's best practice. So in many cases, we're aware that these studies are costly, and that it's not always possible to do the best practice, but that's why we've been very clear what's minimum and what's best practice. And then specified how information must be included in the report. So details explaining the different habitats present, and then also information showing which species have been found and evidence of that. All right. I am now going to hand over to my co-panelist, Luc Verbrugge, to explain one of the new areas that we've included in this guideline for the first time, but is quite critical in the assessment process. So Luc, can you come on? Can you put your webcam on and come on, please, and explain this project area of influence?
Hi there. Tilla, will you be turning off your webcam?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'd just like to go over the defining the project area of influence, because as a minimum requirement, the protocol requires that the development footprint site is surveyed and presented in terms of species of conservation concern and impacts. However, it's very, very rare that impacts are actually confined to specific development footprints, and these are usually extend well outside of the borders, and therefore it's quite important to define this area of influence, and it is actually a taxon-specific definition. So each taxon specialist, whether it be a botanist or a herpetologist, would need to define the project area of influence based on their understanding of the proposed activities and the influence on the receiving environment. So the best practice is to apply this to the site footprint and see which part of surrounding the project footprint constitutes a secondary impact, because the primary impact would be the sites where the development is going to take place itself, and then also the tertiary impact. And this is quite important in terms of where you need to sample and what is going to be an appropriate monitoring site to detect any influences post development on the sort of receiving environment. A quick example to explain why this is necessary is, for example, if you consider, since we're talking about the terrestrial protocol here, birds fly great distances past a particular site, and if they use a particular area to fly, if you put a wind energy generation plant in the way, there's likely to be impacts far beyond the actual footprint of where that wind turbine project is going to be situated, specifically for species of conservation concern that might be nesting elsewhere and using those flyways. And so just to wrap this up then, the project area of influence is specific to the receptors that you need to define, and there's a section just after this in the guidelines about how to define impact receptors, because the particular impact receptor, so in this case, the example I gave you, vultures flying past, or maybe a fish in the river that might be polluted, will define the actual area, how far outside of the site footprint, which will potentially be impacted by any of the activities taking place during this proposed development. Okay, I think that about wraps it up. Tilla?
Thank you. Thank you. So we're now going to go on to the first session of questions.
Wonderful. We will start then with the first question from Noman. And the question is, are these species EA being a part of the EIA process for any projects in the area?
Sorry, can you just say that again, please?
Sure. Are the species EA being a part of the EIA process for any projects in the area?
I'm not clear what they mean.
Okay. Norman, if you could give us a little more information regarding your question, I'll round back to it in the question section, okay? Let's see if he did. All right. Let's go to the second question. Is the contact person for the numbered sensitive species included in the screening report? That's from Luanita.
Repeat that.
Is the contact person for the numbered sensitive species included in the screening report?
Yes, so the contact details of where you apply for that sensitive species information is included in the screening report and also in the guideline.
Wonderful.
So
thank you.
It's a specific email that comes to SANBI, and we have a staff member who responds to that, collects the information required, and then disseminates what the information about sensitive species.
Wonderful. Next question is from Noman. For how long have the species been investigated?
That's a very good question. So we use all information that we have on a particular species to produce those models. So that can be information collected over the last 50 to 100 years. However, we have to have very precise information to inform a model. So often historic records don't have good information about where the species was collected. As I mentioned earlier, that the high and the very high levels, we only use records collected post 2002. So we have to be very sure they're recent and they're very accurate. So since people have been using GPSs, so we can be absolutely sure that the species is where it is. And of course, for mobile species, it's not as easy. So for birds and for mammals that move around, it's not as easy to be sure. But for invertebrates and hepatofauna and plants, it's easier to be relatively sure that the species is within that restricted habitat where it's been recorded. So for birds, we use key nesting sites for that very, very, very high category.
Great, thank you. Noman did clarify the question that was asked earlier. What he was asking was, are these guidelines normally being used and made utilized as a part of the total EIA requirements for any projects currently?
Okay, so not yet, Norman. So these are new guidelines, and it's the first time they've been developed. They're not yet gazetted for use. They're not. The legal requirement is the actual protocol. That's the regulation that's gazetted for implementation under South Africa's EIA legislation. The guidelines explain how to implement the protocol. The protocol went out for public comment, and it has not yet been gazetted for implementation. We expect it to be gazetted for implementation within the next couple of months. So once it's gazetted for implementation, these guidelines will come into use. And to date, there has been no such guideline. And as I explained right at my first few slides, we have been concerned about the lack of standardization in specialist work, which is one of the reasons why we felt the need to develop these very clear guidances.
Wonderful. Sean Taylor from the Enel Green Power asks, in the species list, could you please elaborate on what species number refers to and where the list can be found to identify?
Okay, so the species that are shown in that list, they are generated in the screening tool. So when you put in your development footprint, you get a report with that list. Okay, so you know that those are the species likely to occur on that site, and it's those species that need to be looked for in the specialist studies, and it also gives a very clear indication for EAPS which specialists are required. So if birds are being triggered by the uploading of that footprint for that particular development site, then you need an avifaunal expert, ornithologist. And so if no, for example, no amphibian or reptile is triggered, you don't need a herpetologist expert. And so we actually foresee that there needs to be less specialist studies than have been the case previously, where for all EIAs you needed, for full EIAs you needed to have the suite of different specialists going out. Here we actually you only have to get the specialist if the screening report requires you to get that specialist in. I hope that makes sense.
Wonderful. Monique asks, she says, the protocols only refer to very high or low sensitivities. There seems to be no guidance on sensitivities that may be medium, for example. You state that EAPs can only compile the compliance for low sensitivity. Please comment on how it is indicated in the protocols and why you have assumed that the other sensitivities must be addressed by a specialist.
Okay. I'm going to ask Abubele to answer this one, if she's able to. Abu, would you like to answer that?
Sure. So for the species protocol, there are 4 sensitivity ratings on there: very high, high, and medium. And those, Tilla has explained what data has gone into and why they assume that those are high and those are medium or very high. And then the low sensitivity, Tilla, maybe you want to expand on why the confidence levels of saying that's low sensitivity and that only needs to be a compliance statement? I think that's what Monique is asking.
Yeah, so So we basically have put a huge amount of effort to model all possible habitats for species of conservation concern. So the type of species we would like to make sure are not impacted in the development process. So because those models have that's that medium level, include areas where we haven't previously found the species, but it's suitable habitat. Where we don't have any model data, so in the areas that are green, and that's quite a lot of the country, by the way, we are really, we can never be completely sure, but we have very high confidence that there aren't species of conservation concern there. And the confidence level that we are using a 95% possibility of a species being in an area to include it in those models. And so where we have low confidence, with low expectation of species of conservation occurring, we really don't want to have to put the developer, the applicant, through the expense of getting all the specialists out when there's very, very little chance of there being specialists there. So we are trying to do whatever we can to make the environmental impact assessment process as streamlined as possible, as cost effective as possible. And for that reason, we've had to be very clear that you can't have a specialist going out for every piece of land in the country. Hence the low category is we don't expect species of conservation concern there, and we require the EAP to confirm that. And there is a field visit required, but it doesn't need to be done by a specialist. It can be done by a generalist, and then a compliance statement needs to be completed following that. And then there is in the guideline we also explain, and it's also in the protocol, that there is a case where it is possible that that a species has that an area has been identified as highly sensitive, but has subsequent to the development of the information, and for some reason there can be errors in the actual mapping. So for example, an area might have been transformed and that's been mismapped. That doesn't happen very often, but there is a small chance that can happen. And so the EAP also has the ability to show if the development footprint, if the trigger information is incorrect, they can provide the evidence for that by doing an initial site verification step and then writing a compliance statement. But they have to show and give good evidence that the sensitivities identified in the screening tool are not actually there.
Thank you. Next question. Are the buffer sizes proclamated, and are they fixed with regarding topography and existing structures being a variable?
So are the buffers, are you saying, are they legally enforceable? What was the word that was used?
Proclamated?
Okay.
Or are they fixed?
No, so they're not fixed. They're a guidance and a recommendation, and the specialist is able to motivate for different buffers depending on the taxon group. So it depends on the taxon group. So for certain taxon groups and to certain species, they're very clear what exactly the buffers must be. And for others, it gives guidance to the specialist how they actually should identify the size of the buffers. Luke, I don't know if you want to add to that. Would you like to?
Yes, sure. I would just like to point out that for many of the species, we've been able to give the recommended buffer and then the minimum buffer as well. So in cases where the minimum buffer does not allow for connectivity to occur between subpopulations, then the maximum buffer needs to be applied. And it's also important to note that when applying a particular buffer, areas of transformation, so for example, if you have a species in close proximity to a mall, like Tilla showed in the presentation, it makes no sense to include that mall inside the buffer. So you know where the population is, you've applied a buffer around it, and then areas of transformation are excised from that buffer. So that's how we use, we term that as a functional buffer in a sense, because it doesn't make sense to have half the mall as the buffer around that particular population. I hope that's answered the question.
Great work, thank you. The next question comes from Barbara. Can you clarify the specific the taxon-specific specialists? She says this is critical because the draft legislation stipulates that a fauna specialist can only address to specific taxons per site. When these SCC lists expand to include snails, millipedes, ants, orthoptera, scorpions, and spiders, all on the IUNC red list, this means that several specialists will have to go out if the SCCs are triggered in the area. This would be a huge cost.
Okay. Thank you. I mentioned earlier that at the moment there's only butterflies included in the invertebrate data. It will be include a couple more, but any entomologist should be able to pick up these species. So we only require one entomologist specialist. We do specify in the guideline that no specialist may represent more than 2 taxonomic groups, and that is really important because in the past we have had situations where one specialist was employed to work on at least 4, even more different species groups. And while there are people out there who are excellent naturalists and have a wide variety of knowledge, the reality is what we were seeing in the specialist reports was not an adequate level of accuracy to reflect the different species of conservation concern on site, and we were getting really somebody who was more of a specialist in one field and didn't really know enough about the other taxonomic groups. So what this means is that we actually have been very clear to say you can't do more than 2 taxonomic groups to ensure that we get a level of quality from the specialist reports that are required. Yes, it's very, very unlikely that there would be more than 3 specialists needed to go out, faunal experts needed to go out to one site. It's highly unlikely that there would be a situation where all of the species are on that one site. So and we have allowed at least 2 specialities to be fulfilled by one specialist. So I hope that answers the question.
It worked. Next, Karen asks, to what extent are the guidelines aligned to international practice for biodiversity and ecosystem services assessment, in particular IFC?
Thank you for that question. We have aligned it, and I'll ask Luke to explain exactly how we've done that.
Okay, so all of the guidelines from IFC have been reviewed and taken into account during our development of these guidelines, specifically when it comes to estimates of site ecological importance, where we use international accepted measures for measuring conservation importance, etc., in terms of using IUCN criteria, or the IFC triggers for critical habitat, etc., are all captured in the guidelines. And so we feel that all of this is actually in direct compliance with the IFC, with the eye of making the standard assessment IFC compliant, essentially, when specialists adhere to these guidelines. Is that? I hope that answers the question sufficiently.
Tanya, could I just remind you that we do still have a chunky section of technical work to explain. So maybe
Absolutely,
we could
that was
later.
Would you like to stop questions at this juncture and go on to the poll?
I think we should do that.
Okay,
We can
just
come
so
back to the questions at the end of the talk.
Absolutely. Just so attendees know, we do have dozens and dozens of questions that have come through. So if we haven't been able to get to all of your questions, we will resume at the end of the section and do our best to respond to as many as we can. As we transition, there's a poll that we're going to put up onto your screen. And we would like for you to take a moment to ponder and respond to the poll. So the first poll question that we have is, what is the main challenge members have experienced regards to how specialist studies are currently undertaken? Options: no standardization, lack of scientific rigor or too much uncertainty, too much focus on scientific rigor, or unnecessary costs and data. Fourth, unclear or ambiguous recommendations, or expertise of specialists. So again, the question, what is the main challenge that you members have experienced with regards to how specialist studies are currently undertaken? We'll give another 5 seconds or so to enter your answers. And with that, we will close the poll, collect the responses, and share those responses. So what we have found within this group is the top answer was that 35% of people responded that no standardization was the hardest challenge, followed by lack of scientific rigor or too much uncertainty at 24%, with 22% and unclear or ambiguous recommendations, and then tied at 10%, too much focus on scientific rigor and the expertise of specialists. Thank you for your feedback and your interaction. And I turn the floor back over to Domitila for a continued workup.
Thank you, Tanya. Okay, so we're now going to show you an important new addition to your toolkit for EIA work, and that is something we've introduced in this guideline to evaluate site ecological importance. And so for the specific development site here, this just shows an example here, the development footprint, we require that the specialist undertakes this site ecological importance process. We've done this really quite purposefully in order to put standardization in place. You saw now on the poll that came out of the top concern. What ends up happening at this stage is that many specialist reports contain recommendations and suggestions on what needs to happen for a particular site, but it's really, really difficult for competent authorities to compare that between reports. So what we've put together is a standardized approach so that we can compare apples with apples in the development process. So there are two factors that we look at. The one is the actual biodiversity importance of the site, and that is made up of two things. What conservation elements of what features of conservation importance occur on the site, and then what is the functional integrity in place for those conservation features? Because you could have really important population of species, but if the site is highly degraded, that makes a big difference. And together that makes up the biodiversity importance. And then we combine that, so the biodiversity importance with the receptor resilience. So how resilient is the impact receptor to the activity that will happen on that site? And then that gets combined to identify the site ecological importance. Okay, so I won't go into huge detail here, but it's important for you to be aware that this is included in the guideline. So for the conservation importance, what we've done is identify what the specific different levels of conservation importance, and for each one there's very clear fulfilling criteria. So for example, do you have a confirmed occurrence of a critically endangered, vulnerable, extremely rare, critically rare species that has a tiny extent of occurrence of less than 10 kilometers squared? Okay, or is there any area of critically endangered ecosystem? Is there globally significant populations of congregatory species? So those are the things that qualify as very high. I'm not going to go through them all because we don't have the time now, but it's just to make sure that you're aware that it's not something that one specialist could say one thing and another one could say another thing. You either have that population of a critically endangered species on site or you don't. And so you then easily can qualify against this matrix of which level of importance you come out under. And then the same thing for the functional integrity. So the functional integrity measures the ecological condition of the impact receptor. So, and that's determined by its remaining intact habitat. Apologies, I just need to move something there. So here we're looking at what is the condition of the habitat and how functional it is. So larger the area, the more functional it's going to be. The more invasive species are on the site, or the more degraded it is, the less functional integrity is going to be in place. So again, very, very clear criteria are provided so that the specialist can motivate why they're putting it in the particular category of functional integrity. Okay, then these are combined in this way. So if you have very high functional integrity and very high conservation importance, your biodiversity importance is very high, and then you can see how this matrix works. So very low, if you have very low functional integrity, even if you have very high conservation importance, it brings down the overall biodiversity importance of that site. And I'm sure if you're EAPS or specialists, you've had many situations where you have really, really threatened species, but the site is heavily degraded. And this way allows you to actually represent what's going on from a biodiversity importance factor by taking both the functional integrity and the conservation importance into account. Then the receptor resilience. So you're taking the impact receptor that's identified for that particular taxonomic group. So it might be the habitat of a cliff colony for a breeding bird, or it might be a specific grassland habitat, whichever it is. And you're looking at the intrinsic capacity of the receptor to resist the major damage from disturbance and or to recover its original state with limited or no human intervention. So if there's damage, how easily can that receptor recover? If there's very high resilience, it recovers quickly. If it's very low, very, very slow recovery is expected. And so the way the receptor resilience interacts with biodiversity importance is that if you've got very high receptor resilience, it brings down the overall site ecological importance. Whereas if it's very low receptor resilience, so it's a very sensitive receptor, then you're going to have it coming out in a higher category. So I hope that makes sense. It's all detailed in the guidelines. We know this is a lot to take in one webinar, but what we wanted to show you is that we've got these very clear ways of categorizing the features, the biodiversity features on site, so that you can actually communicate that. And how this ends up being implemented is that each specialist needs to undertake the site ecological importance and map it spatially. So in this example that you're seeing on the screen at the moment, for one particular development footprint, you could see here the different categories coming out for the site ecological importance, and that would be different for the different taxonomic groups. So this is for flora and this is for birds. And then the EAP has the responsibility of combining those together, and you take the highest for any one group and make sure that comes out in the combined. So even though the flora doesn't have a very high, there is very high for the birds, and that may be, for example, a nesting site within a specific plant habitat, and then that comes out as very high, and you combine it to get the outcome you're seeing over here. And that's a simple GIS combination process. If there are questions, you can ask those to Luke later. Right, and so what we require is that each specific habitat gets mapped for any particular development. So here we're showing a development for Kenilworth Racecourse. The proposed footprint of the development site is here. We mentioned earlier the project area of influence needs to be looked at. So here we're requiring that the project area of influence is go through the site ecological importance. So the different specific habitats are mapped, but you also include, so it's a habitat for those species. So if you're the amphibian expert, you're mapping the habitats for the amphibians. If you're the plants, you're mapping the habitats for the plants, and you're including the buffers as mentioned earlier. Okay, and then you're applying the different elements of the site ecological importance. So that's the conservation importance, the functional integrity, the receptor resilience, and then you're coming out with an overall site ecological importance. And so you do that for each particular habitat. So it's each receptor, impact receptor, which in this case is the area of habitat. And it's, you know, for certain, we had a couple of triggers under each of those categories. So it's possible to trigger different levels under one particular for one particular receptor. So for example, if you have sandy fynbos habitat on the Kenilworth Racecourse, that's triggering very high because it's a critically endangered ecosystem, but it also contains a number of critically endangered plants and an endangered species, and so that's triggering high. But for every time, you'd always take the highest level. So the very high would come out here, the functional integrity comes out as very high. When you combine it all, it comes out as very high for the overall site ecological importance for that. And then that ends up being mapped. So here you see the mapping. So if I just go back a step here, in this particular case, the sand fynbos habitats and the wetland habitats will both come out as very high. And when that gets mapped, it looks like this. So you can see with the, once you've done that for the project area of influence and you go back to your development footprint, it's very clear that the development footprint is going to have areas which have very high site ecological importance, and so that obviously needs to be taken into account in the way that you apply the mitigation hierarchy. And so within the guideline, we also put in what it means. So for very high site ecological importance, it means avoidance is the mitigation option. No destruction or development should be considered, and et cetera, et cetera. So high, avoid mitigation wherever possible, minimize it, change infrastructure design, et cetera. So we're giving very, very clear guidance as much as we were able on what needs to happen. And we really hope that this will make the decision-making process a lot easier for competent authorities and for EAPS, who get very, different reports from different specialists. We're really hoping this will make things much easier, because the same system needs to be applied, and these tables and these figures, these graphic figures, should be quickly allow you to understand what is actually the situation on the site. And that's it from us. Just to mention that we have presented this to the Working Group 5 group, the group of government where the competent authorities all sit. And this has been welcomed, and we've also had comments in the period. So while the protocol was out for public comment, the guidance was also out, and we've had extensive comments submitted for the guidelines, and those obviously in the process of being addressed at the moment. So we expect that the next couple of months between the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fisheries, they will be addressing the comments that have come in from the protocol, while SANBI will be addressing the comments that have come in from the guideline, and that both, once we have been able to address these, then both of these will be gazetted for implementation. But if the comments require major changes, and the comments that have been received for the guidelines don't require major changes, we still have to meet with DEF to see what the protocol comments mean. But if they require major changes, they'll be issued again for public comment. If they don't require major changes, then they get gazetted for implementation, and we suspect that's likely to happen in the latter half of this year. That's it from us, and I think that there's now time for more questions. And we'll take as many as we can in the time that's remaining, and then there's a final poll. Thanks, Tanya.
You're welcome. First question is from Lori. Are the guidelines, once they're have gone through the process, will they be legally binding, and will they be able to halt or delay potentially destructive development projects?
So the guidelines the guidelines, as I've mentioned before, they respond to the protocol requirements. So everything in the guideline is a response to clauses in the protocol, and the protocol is legally binding. So the guideline provides a methodology. The guideline itself is not legally binding, but it is giving the method in which the protocol needs to be implemented, and the protocol is legally binding. So that makes the guideline pretty important to follow. Abubele, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you're 100% right, Tilla. So under NEMA, the protocols are the ones that are legally enforceable. And like you said, the guidelines give guidance on how to implement the protocol. So essentially, they work hand in hand.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next question comes from Natalie. How often will the species section of the screening tool be updated?
Thanks, that is a really important question. So the data going into the screening tool, we are at the moment updating on a 6-monthly basis. It will probably end up stabilizing to a yearly update. But as it's new, we're trying to get it as good as as good as it possibly can be. So at the moment, it's 6-monthly updates going in, and then probably in a year or two, it will go down to annual. And then just to note that we haven't red listed every single group or species in South Africa, and particularly for invertebrates, we have red list assessments for all vertebrates and for all South Africa's plants, and we don't yet have for every invertebrate group, and we never will have, but we are working to improve the number of invertebrate groups covered. And so as each new group gets red listed, we will add those species onto the screening tool. And the final version of the guideline will have a web page which allows specialists to go and look for any new updates. And we'll keep those obviously to the minimum, but if anything changes, we will publish those online so that there's one place that you go to for any updates.
Fantastic. Adrian says, go ahead, Luke.
May I please just add to that, an important aspect of the updating of the species layers for the environmental screening tool is the fact that we rely constantly on new information to be collected. And a very important aspect of this is during the environmental impact assessment phase, when specialists go out to the field and are actually there collecting data, that information is very important to disseminate to platforms that SANBI can access, such as the virtual museums or iNaturalist, etc. So we have included a section in the guidelines specifically dealing with the necessity for specialists to at least disseminate their information regarding species of conservation concern whenever they encounter them during their field work as part of the environmental authorization process. Thank you.
Very good. Adrian said, this is great stuff. What plans are being put into place to train the various competent authorities throughout the country?
Okay, so thanks for that. We are very fortunate in that we have at the moment a program that's being run to strengthen enforcement for EIAs across the country, and part of that is a capacity development work and capacity enhancement work for competent authorities. So there's training happening for all of our competent authorities at the moment, and that's taking place and will continue to take place for the rest of this year as part of the Global Environment Fund project. But we're also planning on making sure that training is available digitally, and we're going to specifically produce a short digital movie on specifically aimed at competent authorities, so they know exactly what they can use and look for in the reports, and how they can use the guideline to streamline their work. So that, and then we'll do similar training material for EAPS and for specialists linked to the guideline and the protocol.
Wonderful. Next question comes from Hilton. This is for terrestrial species. When will aquatic and marine guidelines be drafted, especially with the potential for imminent marine floor mining taking place?
Sure, that's a very important question. So immediate next steps is to develop guidelines for the two protocols that are already gazetted for implementation. That's the terrestrial biodiversity and aquatic protocols. So that's the immediate next step, and that is freshwater aquatic environments. And we're actually underway at the moment to get the group of specialists to work on that. We already have a work that was undertaken as part of this project. We've really got a good starting point for the aquatic guideline. However, we have not yet started on marine, and this is really, really important. We are set back by a paucity of data for the marine environment. We don't have the quality of data that I've showed here, where we can model species distributions and know exactly where certain species occur. But we are moving ahead, and we've just produced in our National Biodiversity Assessment marine ecosystem data, and we've assessed in detail the threat status of ecosystems. So we could get that information out in for CU's decision making. That would be really important. It's not yet currently on the cards, but it's something that we can request the department to look at and to bring in. That's really a key point. Thanks.
Robin asks, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just let me, Abu, do you want to add anything else on that last point?
No, Tilla, I think you covered it.
Okay, thanks. Tanya?
Great. Robin asks, if the biodiversity category comes up as high or very high, how do you know what specialist to send to the site?
Okay, so this is a question probably coming from somebody who's used the tool and they've intersected with the biodiversity layer, which is the terrestrial, it's actually the terrestrial ecosystem biodiversity layer. So since December, we've included the species information, so it's relatively recent. And now when you put your footprint on, it will specifically say in the screening tool, it will list the species that you intersect with, and it's then it says, okay, these are birds, these are mammals. So then you know that you have to get the specialist for those. It also has a sentence that says you need these experts to go out, these specialists. So I think probably you're thinking of before December when you intersected only with the biodiversity layer, which would have just said high biodiversity or very high biodiversity or low. And that's intersecting only with the ecosystem data and not with the species data.
And just to jump in there, Tilla, as well, with the ecosystem data, I mean, the screening tool does also specify that even in a high ecosystem, you are either in a CBA, an ESA, protected area, etc. So the screening tool report will specify, even if it's a species data layer or the terrestrial or aquatic data layer, it will tell you exactly what the sensitivity is that your development footprint intersects with.
But the question is, how will they know what specialists to send out? So if it's not intersecting with species data, then it can be a general ecologist. But if it is intersecting with species data, then it needs to have specialists out.
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Next question comes from Clayton. Is DMR being included as a competent authority?
Abu Bailey, I'm going to ask you to answer that one.
No, so the screening tool, the National Web-Based Screening Tool is run by DEA. Except if you're doing a mining application, then DMR wouldn't be involved, no. So if it's mining, then the competent authority would be DMR, yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Speaking of mining, we have a question from Emily. She would like to understand how this valuable guideline and protocol could align with mine closure planning.
Luke, do you want to answer that? If you can.
Okay, so this guideline and the protocol is written for the environmental authorization process. And in the environmental authorization process, as part of that, there's the requirement for an environmental management or monitoring plan, an EMPR. And in this EMPR will be the specifics and the outcomes of the monitoring that are required for the closure plan. And so actually, this is a very important question because our guideline does not specifically address the closure part of this. It's more to deal with the environmental authorization at the inception phase and the operation phase of a development. But that's a very important aspect that I think we would need to just have a look at, and it's possibly something that needs to be dealt with at a higher level, so in terms of at the protocol level itself, so that there is a specific statement in that regard that we need to provide guidelines for. Maybe Abu, do you have something to add to that?
No, Luke, like you said in the protocol, it takes mention of all the things that people would need to do, things that would need to be included in the environmental management program, but that's as far as the protocol goes. It just talks about environmental management plans, and I assume that would include mining activities, but that's as far as the protocol goes.
Yes, and I think one of the aspects that we do take into account is with the recommendations in regards to the site ecological importance. There are specific statements made there about how and what is possible in terms of applying the mitigation hierarchy. And one of the things about applying the mitigation hierarchy obviously has to do with restoration after the development has taken place. So it might need its own set of guidelines for closure planning, because it's already a very complex and elaborate document here, and I don't know if it would fit under this particular aspect of environmental authorization, but it's definitely something I'll make a note of and we'll consider. So thank you for a great question.
Great, thank you, Luke. Saudia asks, is a permit with specific conditions granted after all of this is completed? And how do you determine compliance? Or what other measures are in place to help determine compliance?
So I'm going to ask our Bella to answer this one. As Luke said, we have been asked to do this work for the actual authorization stage, so we're not the experts on compliance. But Abu, can you see how much you could answer this?
Yes, so maybe Luke can help me out here. So yes, at the end of this process, once somebody has submitted their specialist assessment in the entire EIA, they're applying for environmental authorization. So at the end of it, authorization may be granted or refused, and if it's granted, it will contain specific conditions, such as things that you need to do in the environmental management plan. And then in terms of compliance, I'm not sure who actually checks for if all the developments that have been approved in the country are actually complying with their the conditions of the environmental authorization. Luke, do you know?
So there is an environmental audit that needs to take place to ensure that there is compliance with the environmental management plan. This is a periodic audit that usually takes place and is specified in the EMPR, whether it's 1 year or 2 year period of time, and it's contingent on the development of the EMPR, so it can vary. But when an audit needs to take place, then an independent organization has to evaluate whether there is compliance with the management plan, and if there is not, how to rectify this. This is a very important aspect when it comes to international funding from the IFC, and usually the IFC would do this kind of compliance checks as well. And so, but further than that, I'm not actually sure. It's not really my realm. I will quickly ask a question to one of my environmental assessment practitioners and respond, and then we can just pick this up a little bit later and move on for now if that's possible. Thanks.
It does fall within the responsibilities of the competent authorities, and in South Africa that takes place at the provincial level. Tanya, let's go on to the next question.
Absolutely. So Raja Shakar, who's an ecologist from India, asks, are there any no-go zones to be protected through species EIA surveys for conserving the hotspots for posterity?
Thanks for that question. It's lovely to know that we have international people also on this call. So the very high category that we have put in place for the species layer in this tool, those are really irreplaceable sites, and we strongly encourage no-go decisions to be made on those, but they're not legislated no-go areas. So the decision-making process is an inclusive process, and there's regulations to guide that decision-making process. So we can't regulate no-go at this stage, but we're providing the data to provide really strong motivation of why specific sites are actually no-go, because they are completely irreplaceable. Abu, you may want to add to that.
No, you're perfectly correct, Tula, that there aren't any like legislated no-go areas regarding the protocol, but like Tula said, there are very high sensitivity areas where you would have to prove to the competent authority that the impact you're having on those very high sensitivity areas can be mitigated or whatever. But the very high, like Tula says, are where development is not encouraged at all.
Yeah, because there are no mitigation options for those. It's not even possible to offset them. So hence we're providing that information upfront in a very transparent way, that it's available to every decision maker in South Africa, because it's online, and hence we hope that this level of transparency will make sure that the right decisions are made. If we find that doesn't occur, because this is the first time we're serving this information, if we find that it doesn't occur, then we may take steps to strengthen those particular areas, which are really, really high levels. We do have a particular clause in our Biodiversity Act that we may be able to use. But at this stage, we feel that just providing this information in a very transparent way should ensure the right decisions get made. Thanks.
Barbara asks, could it be clarified? These guidelines and protocols will need to be completed regardless of whether it's a basic assessment or an S&EIR process?
Abu, would you like to answer that? I do know the answer, but you'll probably explain it a bit better than me.
Yes, so the guidelines, the protocols and the guidelines need to be followed regardless of whether it's a basic assessment or a scoping and environmental impact report, because the nature of the screening tool, it doesn't really tell you what listing notices you are triggering with your development. It just shows you what the sensitivities are on site based on the project footprint that you input, and then a screening report comes out, and then the protocols tell you what to do. So the answer is yes, regardless of whether it's a basic assessment or an EIA, the protocols and the guidelines will still apply.
Yes.
Great. Question from Vanessa. The screening tool is done on the footprint area. Does this take into consideration that there may be very high species in the PAOI?
Just repeat the first part of that question.
Yes, the screening tool is done on the footprint area.
Yeah.
Dot, dot, dot.
Yeah, so at the first stage of the project, the applicant or the EAP loads up the footprint of the development footprint. And then what we've included in the guideline is the identification of the project area of influence. That needs to be, as Luke explained earlier, taxon specific. And then what the recommendation is to re-upload the project area of influence shapefile into the screening tool to get additional data from the whole project area of influence. So it's an iterative process, and that's detailed in the guideline.
All right, Robin asks, currently, a common approach for terrestrial ecological report to comprise a general overview of all major taxa, for example, plants, mammals, birds, heptafauna, and butterflies. Will this no longer be necessary, or will the taxon specialist only be brought in when a species is flagged?
Correct. They will only be brought in when the screening tool flags that those species are on site. And in this way, we are really trying to streamline the decision making, the environmental authorization process.
Great. We have a question from Hilton. Has the Department of Mineral Resources been engaged and trained on this guideline regarding ASA competent authority? Let me reread that for you. Has the mineral department?
But I think it is very similar to the question earlier on whether they are competent authority. But they no, they have not yet been trained. But they are an audience that we can provide the training to. Just as we mentioned, we will provide specific training to the different user groups of that will utilize the protocol and the guideline. But no, they have not yet been trained. This is very, very new. This is the first information sharing of this guideline, and it's only going to be finalized in the next few months.
Luanita asks, does the guideline propose a limit of acceptable change for SEI? For example, a loss of a site with medium SEI is not acceptable even with management and mitigations?
Luke, do you want to answer that?
Sorry, if I could just hear the question one more time, I will try to answer that question.
Yes, one moment. Let me find it. Does the guideline propose a limit of acceptable change for SEI? For example, the loss of a site with medium SEI is not acceptable even with management and mitigations.
Okay, that's a very good question, because there's no easy way to propose a hard and fast limit for anything actually in this frame, except for the very high where you cannot have any development take place, where avoidance mitigation is the only option. That's really the only one where we have a hard and fast rule. For anything other than that, there has to be an acceptable demonstration of how the mitigation hierarchy is applied. And the competent authority will need to make a decision whether that is acceptable or not in the frame of the biodiversity management that they are managing. So what that means is that it depends also entirely on the type of development, because certain developments have got greater impacts on those particular habitats than others. So the site ecological importance would be maybe still very high, but it might be acceptable to apply a particular mitigation measure for certain types of development, but not for others. And so I think it needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis by the competent authority, and the specialist's job is to provide their inputs and their understanding of the situation as well. And the environmental assessment practitioners are supposed to then collate all the different specialist inputs in this regard and then present that to the competent authority so that they can make the final decision, because it's not the EAPS or the specialist job to make that final decision, just to provide guidance on it.
Great.
Wonderful. And with that, we are going to transition into some poll questions that Domitila and her colleagues would like to know your feedback on. So we will move on to that. So the first question is, does the guidelines document provide sufficient information to enable the correct application of the animal and plant protocols? Please select one of the following answers: yes, no, or uncertain. Again, does the guidelines document provide sufficient information to enable the correct application of the animal and plant protocols? We'll give that another 3 seconds and close. Share. The answer with 55% response is yes. Then an 8% of no, and a 37% of uncertain. Next, we will ask an additional poll question. Is the method described for the evaluation of site ecological importance understandable? Please respond yes, no, or uncertain. We'll close that poll in 3, 2, 1, and share. Overwhelmingly, 78% said yes, 4% said no, and 19% were uncertain. Third, do you support the standardization of how ecological sensitivity is evaluated at the site level? Yes, no, or uncertain. Again, do you support the standardization of how ecological sensitivity is evaluated at the site level? Yes, no, or uncertain. 3 more seconds. 2, 1, and close. Results of this: 84% responded yes, 6% responded no, and 10% responded uncertain. Final poll for the day is this: do you understand what is meant by a species compliance statement and what information this must contain? Please respond yes, no, or uncertain. Again, the question: do you understand what is meant by a species compliance statement and what information this must contain? Closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. We have an even balance in the answers here. Yes is 38%, no is 28%, and uncertain is 34%. Wonderful. So Domitila, if you would you please progress to the next slide as we wrap up our presentation today. Thank you so much for being here as participants in a wonderful presentation. Much thanks to all of the presenters in our panel in the wisdom that they've had to share and the instruction that they've been able to provide us in this up and coming exciting time for South Africa. In addition, please note that there are many things going on within the world of IAIA. You can visit our website at www.iaia.org, where you will find many other webinars that are available on demand. We do have something called a professional development program that is an online course open for registration right now, and it has a strong mentorship component to complement the online material. We also have an annual IAIA conference with pre-conference training courses, with next year's to be held in Seville, Spain. And because of the lack of being able to hold this year's conference, we will be holding an online symposia in October of 2020. So please watch the website for information and registration details for that event. And finally, on the website, you'll be able to find lots of information regarding best practice principles, IA fast tips, and much more. Thank you once again for being here for the presentation. You will receive a link to the recording in 1 to 2 days, and there will be a brief survey for you to complete upon your completion of this this event. So if you would please take a few moments to answer a few short questions, we would greatly appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for attending.